Welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at our Watershed Wednesday program, sponsored by E&E Systems of Canton, Massachusetts. I'm Andres Ripley, NEPRA's Greenway and Natural Resource Specialist, and I will be your moderator today. The Neponset River Watershed Association is a small, nonprofit, member-supported group with the mission to protect the Neponset River, its tributaries, and surrounding watershed lands. Today's presentation will be by Debbie Merriam, who is a Master Gardener and the Arboretum Director of the Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum in Milton. And she will be speaking about invasive plant species in the Neponset River watershed. Take it away, Debbie.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us today. And I want to start with this definition because I think it's important that everybody understands the difference between weeds and invasive species. So a weed is a plant growing where it is not desired. And I love to use these two examples, dandelions and purslane. And I love dandelions. I have no problem with them in my yard or anywhere else for that matter. But a lot of people spend a lot of time and money to get rid of them because they don't want them in their lawns or their gardens. But the thing to think about is they're also a really important food source for bees. And so that's the other reason that I like to leave them in my garden. So you can see it's a personal choice when it comes to something like dandelions. And then that goes for purslane as well. Purslane is considered an annoyance weed to a lot of farmers and gardeners, but it's also an important food source in a lot of cultures. So, and if you've ever had it, it's very tasty and has a good supply of vitamin C. So that's how we need to think about weeds, as opposed to how we need to think about invasive species. So an invasive species is an organism that is not native to the place where found and tends to grow and spread easily, usually to the detriment of native species and ecosystems. And it is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So that's the big difference, is that it can be very damaging to our native ecosystems, and it can completely dominate that ecosystem. So if an invasive species dominates an ecosystem, it throws it out of balance because it might not provide the necessary food for insects and any animals or anything living in that environment. And it also suppresses all of the native species as well. So how did these invasives get here? Invasives have been moving around the world since people have been moving around the world. And ships loaded with cargo are stable and do not need ballast water. However, when they're empty, they need to carry ballast water. And that is how a lot of weed seed and invasive species seed has moved around the world. Also, they used to actually use soil as ballast, and that soil would land at other ports, and then any seed in that soil would end up germinating and growing at various ports. Now, this is still the biggest single way that invasive species move around the world, and that is in shipping. So there's two kinds of invasive species movement. Obviously, the unintended that I just talked about, but there's also intended. And a lot of species have come here through gardening and landscaping as ornamental plants. Purple loosestrife is a great example, and so is barberry. Sport fishing is another one that's brought a lot of invasive fish here. Erosion control is a really big one, especially for really invasive species, because they do a good job in controlling erosion. And then finally, there's home aquaria and pets. And some of you may know that in the Everglades, pythons have become a huge issue, and they're eating all of the native species that live there. So again, and there's unintended. Beyond the ship ballast, we have nursery stock, hemlock woolly adelgid, it's an invasive pest that has killed many of our native hemlock trees here. And packing and shipping materials. So that would be the pallets that things are shipped in. So Asian longhorn beetle came into the United States that way. And then ship ballast, the zebra mussel, which is a huge problem in the Great Lakes, arrived here. So how do they become invasive? Seeds germinate early and the seedlings grow faster. They flower earlier and they run to seed in profusion and mature ahead of other wanted plants. They can survive under adverse conditions, including very serious drought. The seed viability can remain intact for years. Some plants, the seed viability can last up to 50 years. And many invasives are vegetatively propagated and spread rapidly. And vegetative propagation means that if there's even just a piece of the plant left in the soil, it can create a new plant via this method. So I'm going to talk about some northeast invasive plants that are particularly problematic in this area, in the watershed, as well as outside of the watershed. This is Mile-a-Minute vine, which is problematic in the foul meadow area, but it's also moved around this area quite rapidly. In fact, we didn't have it at all and maybe 5 years ago, and now it's become a problem for us. And we're just a mile away from the foul meadow. But we've managed, this plant was brought here as an ornamental because of this beautiful purple fruit it has. But it basically grows very rapidly, and it shades out our native plants so they can't photosynthesize. But the thing to think about is that if this is an annual plant, so its life cycle is only 1 year long. So if you can get rid of it before it goes to seed, you're much more likely to have success. So you can just pull it up. It does have little barbs on it, so you want to make sure you're wearing long sleeves. And if you can pull it out before it goes to seed, that's great. But if you can't, you don't want to put it in your compost pile because it will just start growing again. So you need to cover it up or put it in a dumpster if that's your last resort. So most invasive species you need to think about as far as removal before they fruit or flower. So you need to understand the plant life cycle. So bittersweet is a big problem in this area, and it's a problem because it grows vegetatively. Also, it produces a lot of seed, and it's a beautiful ornamental. People put it on their doors during the holidays because it's very pretty. But it's also a woody invasive species, and it has this ability to vine and grow very rapidly. But this is our bittersweet invasion here in our woodlands at the Wakefield. And we decided that we were going to begin tackling this. Now, we don't use herbicides, so we use the method which is called carbohydrate starvation, which is we just keep cutting it down and cutting it down. And so after about 3 years, this is what we have. And it's a long-term project, but we have all of a sudden this. I just took this picture this morning. The spice bush is coming back and blooming, and we have a lot of spring ephemerals, including one of my favorite, which is bloodroot. So garlic mustard is also problematic, and garlic mustard has a biennial, so it's a 2-year cycle. So it only produces the flowers and seeds in the second year. And once it produces those flowers and seeds, it is very prolific seeder, so it will produce a lot of plants, and the seeds can stay viable in the soil for a long time. So we deal with this plant by just cutting it down before it flowers. We just cut it down with a mower or a weed whacker, because we found if you pull it out of the ground, you're leaving growing space for another garlic mustard plant to come back in. Japanese knotweed has become a huge problem here, and this is a very difficult plant to control. It was brought here as for erosion control as an ornamental, and it is a very heavy cedar, and it's actually quite beautiful when it flowers, but it's like bamboo, and it's very thick, and it has rhizomes in the ground, so it's very difficult to control. So we fortunately don't have a lot of this plant on our property, but there's a lot of herbicides being used to control this plant, and so far it has not been particularly successful. Black swallowwort is another big one in New England, and it was brought here as an ornamental plant. It has these beautiful weird purple flowers, and it produces these big pods that have seeds much like cattails that blow around, and so it's very prolific cedar. Again, we handle this plant by mowing it down as often as possible and not letting it produce these big pods of seeds. So I want to talk about a couple of invasive species that are problematic in the watershed. And this, according to Neponset River watershed, is one of the biggest ones right now. It's the most problematic, and that is the water chestnut. But the good news about water chestnut is it's actually manageable. And you can see all these folks in their canoes, and it comes out of the water and can pull it out quite easily. And these are little nutlets that the plant produces. And the goal is to get rid of this plant before it produces the nutlets, or these are the seeds that will produce the plant for next year. So it is manageable, but it takes a lot of effort to pull all of these plants out of the water. And the problem with this plant is it chokes out the native plants that grow in the water, and it also makes it difficult for recreation. So Phragmites has been around for a long time, and we actually have a native Phragmites that is not an invasive, is not problematic, but the invasive Phragmites, Phragmites australis, is a big problem. And for a long time, no one could figure out how to manage it. But just in the last couple of years, it's been found that if you cut Phragmites below the level of water, it actually drowns. So this is one management technique that's being used now, as opposed to using things like herbicides. And so it's really interesting to think, like, a plant that grows in the water can actually be drowned, but if it's cut below the surface, unlike a cattail or something that would still survive, the Phragmites dies off. But the other interesting thing about Phragmites is it fixes nitrogen. So I'm from the New Jersey area, and if you drive through the meadowlands and you see nothing but Phragmites growing everywhere, it's actually probably doing a pretty good job, because it's cleaning up the meadowlands area by fixing nitrogen there. And another one is the purple loosestrife, and it is a beautiful looking plant. And in fact, Nancy said she was just at a sale not that long ago, and somebody asked if they had any for sale. So I thought that was interesting. And not only is purple loosestrife invasive, but it also takes over from our native goldenrod. And what's important to think about is this is an example where purple loosestrife does provide food for bees and insects that need pollen. But the food that purple loosestrife provides is not as nutritious as the food that goldenrod provides for bees and other pollinators. So it does substitute in a certain way in the ecosystem, but does not provide the same amount of important nutrients for our pollinators. And this is controlled, the way to control loosestrife is biocontrol. And we were actually part of this process with the Neponset River watershed, where we raised beetles and the beetles would actually eat the purple loosestrife. And this woman, Mary, is a big volunteer at Wakefield, but she was also a beetle raiser for the Neponset River watershed. So there are ways to control invasive species, bringing insects from the native country where the species is from, but you have to be very careful when you do that, because that species could also become invasive here as well. But fortunately, it did not happen with the beetle that was brought here to control the purple loosestrife. So what can we do beyond what I talked about earlier of thinking about how we can control invasive species? The most important thing you need to do is identify what you're dealing with. And because in order to understand how to deal with it, you have to be able to understand the life cycle. And also you have to be able to understand what is the best way to get rid of the plant, or at least I always say manage it, because it's really hard to completely eradicate some of these invasive species. So we need to be able to identify them. And UMass has one of the best invasive species identification websites I've ever seen. So I would highly recommend looking at that site if you're looking for the best place to learn about all kinds of invasive species and how to control them. The other thing is prevention. And that comes from being able to identify them and then bring up the subject to the city or the state if you see large tracts of invasive species or invasive pests. And then beyond that, what we can do on our own properties or even in the Neponset River watershed is think about working to remove them. And the most important part is remove them before they develop flowers or fruit, because that is what is helping them spread. I highly recommend avoid using chemicals at all costs, because they are definitely bad for our environment and the watershed as well. And then monitoring. As I showed you in the our woodland there, we're constantly monitoring the area to make sure we have now that we've really brought the invasive species into a manageable level, we need to make sure that there's no explosions going forward. So I mentioned it's important to understand the life cycle. So I mentioned we have annuals and we have annuals, biannuals, we have perennials, we have woody plants. So each one has a different life cycle and each one has to be managed a little bit differently. And you need to be able to identify the plant. And I wanted to show this image because the other thing that's very interesting about invasive species is you can see they behave like spring ephemerals. They take advantage of the fact that the trees haven't leafed out yet. So they begin photosynthesizing much earlier than other plant material. And that gives them an advantage, especially in a very shaded area. So this is barberry. It's a problematic species, not only because it's very invasive, but it also harbors ticks and white-footed mice, which white-footed mouse is the vector for Lyme disease. So it's problematic for more than the reason of just being an invasive species. So I mentioned carbohydrate starvation is it's actually the biggest technique that we use to manage invasive species here. And it just means that we're constantly cutting it down so it can't photosynthesize, and eventually it weakens the plant so we can at least control it more readily. And this is a way to manage invasive species and weeds without using herbicides. Digging and pulling can be effective. It can also be very labor intensive and time intensive. And as I mentioned, if the plant, if you don't get the roots of certain plants, that they will just regrow. But a lot of invasive species that have tap roots, if you can pull them out when the ground is moist, you can have an impact that way. So we need to think about these are options as well.
Debbie, I just wanted to give you a 5-minute warning.
Oh, thanks. I think I'm almost done.
Thanks.
I am done. So, so that is the end of my talk. And if anyone would like to ask any questions, that would be great.
That was perfect.
Sorry.
So yeah, now's a good time for questions. So if you do not want to be recorded, make sure that you have your camera off. And again, as Debbie starts to answer some of the questions that I will read out loud from the chat, feel free to also add some additional questions in there as well. So it looks like our first question is from Ian Cook, who asks, with drowning Phragmites by cutting below the water elevation, how long does it have to be underwater to drown? Is a single tidal cycle enough, or does it need to be submerged for a long period?
A single tidal cycle is not enough. I think it takes probably a growing season. That would be my estimation. Yeah.
Okay. I'll wait for a couple more questions to come into the chat. I'll also say at this point that NEPRA is trying to do some more work with invasive removal with some of the towns, mainly when it comes to volunteer polling or working with volunteers one way or another to get this stuff done. So be on the lookout for more opportunities about that on our website. We hope to have some more invasive removal opportunities coming up this summer. And if you do want to learn more or get on an email list regarding these opportunities, you can email me at ripley@neponset.org, which I'll put in the chat shortly as well. Looks like we have a question from Laura, who asks, any advice on lesser salandine? I definitely said that wrong.
Yeah, so we have lesser celandine here, and so what I like to talk about is prioritizing species and how we deal with them. So we have species that are high priority, and they're the ones that I showed you earlier. The celandine is not high priority, but we do remove it when we see it. And again, it has to do with the flowering and the seeding. The pods on that plant are really interesting, and they do produce a lot of seed. So we try to remove it before it seeds. And it does, you have to be careful because it will stain your clothes. But otherwise, we just try to pull it up before it flowers. And, you know, it's an ornamental. People like it because it's pretty, but it can take over your garden really very rapidly if you're not careful.
Thank you. Someone else also asked, would you speak to cases for phytoremediation in plants like bamboo?
To be honest with you, I don't really know that much. Bamboo is a tricky one. I've worked with it only a little bit. Fortunately, I feel very, very happy about that. But the only technique that's I've seen has been really effective is actually digging it out or just, again, carbohydrate starvation. But it's very tricky with something like bamboo.
Okay. Another question is, who was the best point of contact in the municipality to report invasives or seek assistance with private property? Would it be a conservation commission?
I would think for some conservation commissions deal with invasive species. It depends on the town. I think the best thing to do would be to Google it, depending on what town you're in. I know that Milton doesn't have a particular involvement in a lot of invasive species projects, but you can go and look at the UMass website. There's some information there about who you could contact depending on what species you're dealing with. The thing is, there's, you know, a lot of these invasive species have become so problematic in so many places. They're just basically mapping the invasive species at this point, unless you're coming across something like Asian longhorn beetle, where they're actually, you know, it's really important to control those species, or spotted lanternfly. But yeah, it's, I would go to look at the UMass website for information about that.
Thank you. And it also looks like Holly Jones put a good resource in the chat as well, helping with stuff like that. Another question that Heather asked is, are there any tips for removing Virginia creeper?
Well, so Virginia creeper is a native plant, and it's not invasive. It might become, some people would call it an aggressive native, but it's actually a really great wildlife plant. So I would not remove Virginia creeper. I can't recommend that to removing that. If you're confusing that with a non-native English ivy, that's a different story. But the difference is Virginia creeper is, it's not evergreen. It loses its leaves in the wintertime.
Andres, hi, it's Terry Dolan. Could I make a quick question and a comment?
Yes, you can.
Oh, thank you. It's easier than typing it into the chat for me. Thank you, Debbie. This is fascinating. I grew up in Milton, and I am not familiar with the Merriam, Binney, Wakefield Arboretum. Where are you? That's my first question. And I grew up in Milton, but for the last 30 years have lived right along the Neponset in the Baker condominiums here. And I know we've seen knotweed. I'm very familiar with that one, and each year we pull it up and whatnot. Is there, Ian or Andres, is there a map of what we've actually seen along the river? We have a patio at our complex right on the river, which has been closed for the last year, but will be hopefully open fairly soon. And at a really low tide, we can see, you know, a fair amount of growth right below the patio. And I don't know what's good, what's bad, whether it's a good sign or a bad sign to see it. So do we have a map of what's along the Neponset that we've identified over the last 10 or so years? Thanks.
Debbie, you can go first and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, so we are at 1465 Brush Hill Road. We're right behind the Thatcher Montessori School, right below Big Blue Hill. And we are open to the public if you want to come and visit us,
Great.
Monday through Friday. And you can look at our website. We have a lot of events, small social distancing events coming up. So that's wakefieldtrust.org.
Thank you.
And to answer the other part of your question, Terry, I don't think we actually have a map for where these different invasives are. I think we have a general idea as to where they are, especially the large groupings of them on public property, like on DCR land, for example. So I think something that we're starting to working on is getting a larger database of some of these locations, specific invasives, and then trying to figure out which ones are doable to remove with volunteers versus a different removal process that might need to be taken.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think Susan also had a great comment in the chat, which she said, with knotweed hard to dig out, start cutting it down and keep cutting it down each month until frost, then repeat next season and then the following season, and just basically do not let it seed, which I think is an awesome piece of advice there.
Yes, that's the only thing that we've found to work for knotweed, but you have to keep it. It's pretty aggressive. It keeps coming back.
Yeah. Looks like we have another comment here, which says from Ian, we have been talking about using volunteers to help remove invasives, but it would not be feasible to do this frequently at a single spot. Are there particular species that would lend themselves to a periodic volunteer removal efforts a couple times a year?
That's a great question. And I meant to point this out with Mile a Minute because we've had huge success with removing Mile a Minute. And that also has to do with it's because it's an annual. So if you just remove it once late in the season before it puts out fruit, you can have a huge impact on that plant. So I would say that's true for that. Bittersweet, you know, if you have an area that's has a heavy invasion of bittersweet and you cut it, like I mentioned, before it fruits, you can have an impact on that plant. And then finally, barberry is one that is very easy to dig out of the ground, even rather large barberry. So that's another plant. If you can get it before it fruits, you can have a big impact in an area without continually going back. So I would say those three you could definitely have an impact on.
Thank you for that.
It seems like, I don't, to be honest with you, you would answer this, Andreas, but the question about the water chestnut, it seems that you can have an impact on water chestnut if you do removal. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that is correct. I think something that we've started to discuss with some of the towns is, you know, pairing volunteer hand removal with mechanical removal as well. I think there are some great machines that are good at removing water chestnut in areas of the ponds that are at a certain depth. So when it gets too shallow, these machines can't get in those areas safely. And of course, that pairs well with having volunteers who can go in the water in either canoes or waders and use buckets and things like that to take out. So I definitely think water chestnut will be a key plant that we'll be trying to remove in some ponds in the watershed this summer. It's great. I'll give folks another 15 to 20 seconds to put any other comments they have in the chat, or if you also want to unmute yourself and ask a question out loud at this time, that's perfectly fine too.
And there's a lot of invasive species that I didn't get to, but yeah. But I do think you need to think about the treatment fact, and it all has to do with the plant's life cycle. The more you know about the plant and its life cycle, the more opportunity you have to have an impact on it.
Exactly. Thank you for that. I also just put my email address in the chat, so feel free to email me if you want to, you know, get on the email list for any of these invasive removal opportunities. Okay, so give me 1 second. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming today. We also want to thank E&E Systems again of Canton, Massachusetts for sponsoring this Watershed Wednesday, as well as our past 3 presentations. This is actually the last Watershed Wednesday for the season, but we hope to bring it back in the fall. Of course, this recording will be available on our website, hopefully in a little while at neponset.org. So feel free to share this recording once it goes up in around 24 hours or so. And of course, visit our website at neponset.org to learn more about NEPRA and all the work that we do. Thank you everyone for coming today.